your help. Uh, so it is very appropriate that we are celebrating at the moment this day of Darwin's birth because it was on November 24, 50 years ago, this November, which coincides with the date of the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, that I was fortunate to discover this partial skeleton that has the popular name of Lucy, or as the Ethiopians refer to her as Dinkinesh. She is wonderful. And the skeleton and the other fossils from the site of Hadar, of course, in 1978, were all attributed to a new species of Australopithecus afarensis. So there are many reasons why this is a very appropriate time for me to be participating. As you can see, Darwin, Origin of Species was published in 1859 on November 24th, which coincides with the date, of course, of the discovery of the Lucy skeleton. Now, Darwin, as we all know, struggled with the idea of applying his model of descent with modification under, of course, the guise of natural selection. He did not want to stir controversy. He was a very private person. He was a very gentle person. His wife was quite committed to a traditional religious belief as to how humans came to be. And at the final page of The Origin of Species, the only thing he said was, "Light will be thrown." Oh, we've lost our image now. Uh, why have we lost our image? All right. All right. What let's see. The only thing he wrote was, "Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." Well, in the middle 1800s, when religion had such a wide acceptance, people who read Darwin's book, and the average person could read Darwin's book and understand it. And what he was promoting was a major paradigm shift from a creation model of how we became human to a scientific model. And he had a very close friend, Thomas Henry Huxley, who was one of the popularizers of Darwin's ideas. And by the final edition of The Origin of Species, he simply wrote, I can't move these slides again. All right, there we go. He simply wrote in his, "Much light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." Well, what was interesting was his collaboration and conversations with other scholars at that time, primarily Thomas Henry Huxley. And in 1868, 9 years after the publication of The Origin, he began to seriously think about the application of his ideas to our understanding of human origins. And he posed the key questions. Who are the closest living relatives to ourselves? What attributes or features distinguish us from other species? Who were our earliest ancestors? And what were the causes of human emergence? He began to propose a model that brought our ancestors from an ape-like ancestor, not the chimpanzee, as some people misunderstand, but a common ancestor between ourselves and the apes that are essentially or in many ways arboreal. So he suggested that they had to leave the trees and come to the ground. And when they did so, they would become upright walking on two legs, just as all humans are today. And he suggested that the hands were freed and could be used to make and use stone tools. So this would be seen as the birth of culture. And in order to do so, he thirdly or fourthly proposed the idea that we had to have experienced brain expansion, an elaboration in size, an elaboration in capabilities. And this was a very profound prediction on the basis of what he knew, because there were no human fossils known at that time except for Neanderthals, which he really didn't say very much about. Huxley wrote in 1868 in his book, The Descent of Man, and pictured Neanderthals. And I can imagine, having visited Darwin's home in England, that he and Huxley spent many wonderful hours having tea in the garden and walking his sand walk, debating these ideas. All right. So here is Thomas Henry Huxley, whose book, Man's Place in Nature, in 1863, I misspoke and said 1868, but in 1863, he wrote in this book, Man's Place in Nature, which interestingly is the book I read when I was a young teenager, about 13 years old. And the idea, the main idea of Huxley's book was, of course, it is quite certain that the ape which most nearly approaches man in the totality of its organization is either the chimpanzee or the gorilla. And what this implied, and what really captivated me as a young teenager, was there must have been a common ancestor to the African apes, the chimpanzee and the gorilla, and we now know the bonobos, and ourselves sometime deep in the past. So this was an interesting intersection of this important anatomist and, of course, Charles Darwin. We now know that we resemble chimpanzees more than any other ape in Africa or in Asia. And through various molecular phylogenetics, we can see that it appears that gibbons first branched off 17 and a half to 20 million years ago, then orangutans, gorillas about 8.7 to 10 million years ago, and sometime between 6.5 and 8.2 million years, there was a common ancestor to chimpanzees and humans. And yet we are highly divergent in our anatomy and behavior. Darwin saw that, Darwin understood that, and it's obvious to all of us today that humans are significantly different in our anatomy and our behavior from our closest relatives, chimpanzees. We are upright walking, as Darwin had suggested. We are dominated by a very large, highly capable brain. We have become dependent on technology for our survival. We have a very slow period of, a long period of maturation, because we, with such dependency on culture for survival, we have a lot to learn after birth as to how we behave as a species. There's a great deal of social learning. And of course, one of the things that totally separates us from all others is our symbolic language. So when one looks at the phylogeny or the evolutionary relationships of African apes, and some people have called humans the upright ape or the naked ape, as some people have written, but that there is a close association to a common ancestor with chimpanzees. So we can ask the question now, what changed here? And of course, this was uh, something that Darwin wrestled with, as did Huxley and others of that time. And they realized, just as we realize today, that only fossils themselves can yield the answers. We need to discover the evidence for our own ancestral past, going back millions of years. And I have been very fortunate, not only in discovering the Lucy skeleton, but throughout the 70s and continuing to today, very personally involved with trying to understand these fossils and how they relate to one another. Darwin ultimately published in 1871 The Descent of Man, in which he postulated a number of very important hypotheses. Um, and this, of course, brought his ideas directly within the framework, the hypothetical framework of descent with modification and the application of what he referred to as natural selection. He made several important statements in The Descent of Man. He wrote, "In each great region of the world, the living mammals are closely related to the extinct species of the same region." And in this case, it was Africa, and in this case, it was the African apes. And he wrote, "It is therefore probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes closely allied to the gorilla and chimpanzee." And this is a wonderful example of how he has used logic and his own insights to, having studied the natural world, to posit these various ideas, which would ultimately be substantiated long after his death. And as these two species are now man's nearest allies, it is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on the African continent than elsewhere. And that still continues to be true. Uh, One of the most productive areas for finding those fossils that are so important to fit into Darwin's ideas is in Eastern Africa. The Great Rift Valley, including places like Olduvai Gorge, the Turkana Basin here, and most predominantly the Afar region just up here. It was just over 2 weeks ago when I was at this little dot where uh, the site of Hadar is, where Lucy was found 50 years ago. A classic picture of Hadar showing the geological strata. Uh, Darwin would have loved this when he sailed on the Beagle and began to germinate these ideas of change over time. He brought one of the most important books he brought with him was Lyell's Geology. And these are horizontally laid down sediments that could be dated by using various geological methods, but particularly potassium argon. And these fossils at Hadar are exceedingly rich in fossils. Uh, this is where the major portion of uh, fossils attributed to Australopithecus afarensis, which ranges in age from about 3.8 to 3 million years ago, a long lived species that is found widely throughout Eastern Africa, through Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, and I also believe in North Central Africa in a place called Chad. And it is distinctly different from all other species of Australopithecus. It was demonstrably more ape like than other forms of Australopithecus. And from what we know, was probably the last common ancestor to two branches of evolution, one that led to our own genus Homo, our first appearance at about 3.8 million years ago, right on up to the emergence of ourselves. So it is a collection that is continuing to be enlarged. There are well over 500 specimens of this genus. There are two colleagues of mine, Ethiopian scholars, who are in the field at the very moment, collecting additional specimens that will enlarge our understanding of afarensis. And this species is the best known species of the genus Australopithecus and has become the most important reference collection for the discovery of Plio-Pleistocene hominins. Darwin, of course, was very interested and emphasized our significant distinction as upright bipedal creatures. Here are three uh, pelvies. The chimpanzee on the left is a knuckle walking quadrupedal creature on the ground. And below that is Lucy's reconstructed pelvis. We had the sacrum and the entire uh, side of the entire ilium, one side, which was mirror image to make a fairly interesting pelvis. And here is the pelvis that all of us are sitting on at the moment. We belong to Homo sapiens, and you can see that our pelvis is distinctly different from that of a ape, and particularly the chimpanzee. And I won't go into details, but if I ask you to the question of is Lucy's species uh, morphologically, anatomically more like a chimpanzee or more like ourselves, I think you would all answer without any hesitation. It is more similar to our pelvis, and the biomechanics of this pelvis suggest that Lucy's species afarensis was a terrestrial biped who perhaps from time to time did climb in the trees to sleep at night. Um, and let's look at other aspects of bipedalism, such as the foot. Here you see a modern human foot where the greater toe, our large toe, is used not as a grasping organ like you see in the orang or the gibbon or the chimpanzee or the gorilla, but as a propulsive organ. That great toe is used to help us walk bipedally by pushing off from the greater toe or the large toe. Now, there are other aspects that are different. Chimps do not have longitudinal or transverse arches in their foot, but humans do. Um, so that stands in rather strong contrast to an ape foot. Uh, Shortly after the discovery of fossils at Hadar and ascribed to afarensis, the late Dr. Mary Leakey undertook work in Tanzania in at a site known as Laetoli, where to everybody's surprise, and everybody's reward, found a layer of volcanic ash that could be dated to roughly 3.7 million years in age, and also contained fossils of jaws and teeth and so on that were identical to those found at Hadar, so therefore um, coming from Afarensis, or belonging to the species Afarensis. And they found in this layer a trail of human footprints, and you can see quite clearly the strong impression of the greater toe fully lined up with the rest of the foot, the lateral toes here, and a very strong heel strike. And you also get the impression of a arch, longitudinal arch, and a transverse arch. So this was, as we say, the smoking gun that showed that Afarensis was upright, walking, and possessed a foot and a pelvis that were not all that different from our own. So, in with continued research in Ethiopia, in the Middle Awash area of the Afar, a team from the University of California at Berkeley discovered this partial skeleton that is 1,200,000 years older than Lucy, and had some surprising aspects. It had extraordinarily long arms, as you can see, that came well below their knee, with enormous hands. These hands are just shocking in terms of how large they really are. But the one feature that is so surprising is that it possessed a divergent great toe. And you see that here in the bony remains and in a reconstruction by J. Maternus. And this foot was even more divergent in terms of a great toe, more of a grasping organ than we see even in chimpanzees. So it must have spent an enormous amount of time in the trees. This is supposedly a female individual that weighed, well over 120 pounds. And no male specimens would have been found, but because all of these early humans showed a great level of sexual dimorphism, males must have been quite enormous. And how well they did in the trees is an open question. There's a great deal of debate as to the phylogenetic placement of Ardipithecus ramidus, whether it is an ancestor to Australopithecus, or it continued as a separate lineage well into the time of Lucy, because fossils are now being found in that 3 to 3.8 million year time range of individuals that had divergent toes. So its position on the family tree and its relevance to the emergence of Australopithecus continues to be debated. Fortunately, the pelvis, although as you can see in this picture, was very, very crushed, but it was reconstructed by Owen Lovejoy, who is one of the world's experts on bipedal anatomy. And again, you see a chimpanzee and Lucy. The reconstruction suggests that it is certainly not identical to a chimpanzee, and it is perhaps intermediate between a chimp and Lucy. This also has generated a great deal of debate as to whether or not this reconstruction is as accurate as it appears to be, and what this means for bipedalism. Was bipedalism perhaps, as F. Wood Jones said in the early part of the 20th century, an adaptation to walking on the top of large arboreal branches? Um, The foot, as you can see, again, uh, here is Ardipithecus's foot reconstructed, and the incredibly large divergent great toe, which is more like the foot of an orangutan in many ways than some of the African fossils or contemporary African apes. Um, the other aspect to Darwin's ideas, he thought all of these things happened at the same time. We know that he really fingered the most important features: upright walking, brain enlargement, the development of stone tools, uh, coming to the ground, and becoming bipedal. So, what is the evidence for our own genus? And I misspoke a little while ago. The earliest evidence for our own genus is 2.8 million years ago, found again in the Afar region, which at a site known as Lady Gararu, where there is a mandible when mirror imaged, that left half of the mandible, when it's mirror imaged, it has a round shape like our jaws, not parallel sided ape like or afarensis uh, contour. It has various features in the front of the jaw, which remind us of afarensis with a very sloping outline to it. It has other features that are very Homo-like. So the first appearance of Homo, of course, is still unknown, but the oldest appearance thus far is about 2.8 million years. And what is so exciting about that is that it possesses features of afarensis and the genus Homo. So this, I believe, at at the, the 3 million year time period was a period of incredible innovation and changes due probably most likely because of climatic change. And here we go. And there is a trend, of course, in in our fossil ancestry of brain enlargement, which is in some way connected to or correlated with increasing sophistication in technology. It's very interesting. A recent study um, has shown that the average uh, size of Australopithecus is about 466 cubic centimeters. And here down here, you have individuals that can be attributed to afarensis, which is about 20% larger than the mean or average for chimpanzees. And as you can see, through time, there is a increase of brain size. And today, modern humans have roughly 1,300 cubic centimeters as an average size, and brains that are much more sophisticated. Uh, Darwin certainly was wrong when he said that we came to the ground and we became bipeds, and that was connected with freeing the hands for stone tool manufacture. The oldest tools that are universally accepted as being very carefully crafted and intentionally made, which are often referred to as Oldowan tools, come from the site of Lady Gararu, where the 2.8 million year old Homo mandible was discovered. And they are just slightly older than another site known as Gona, where tools are about 2.6 million. We found stone tools at Hadar at 2.4 million years in association with a upper jaw or maxilla that is clearly Homo. And then there are some tools found at Loka Lali, and there are older tools found perhaps older than 3 million at Lake Turkana, very large rocks that were obviously used for bashing bones. I think that what we are seeing is that perhaps earlier than we had envisioned, perhaps Afarensis was beginning to observe the behavior of carnivores and seeing that the bones that were left over by even hyenas could be broken and bone marrow could be extracted from them. So these are tools that were not as sophisticated as those that we see here, which we ascribe to the Oldowan tool tradition. And there is, at the moment, one of my colleagues, Zaresanai Alamseged, who is working at this moment in Ethiopia at a site known as Dakika, where there is a bone which has probably stone tool cut marks on it, but there is great controversy. It's supposed to be 3.3 million years old. But we have never found any stone tools at Hadar or at the site of Dakika that would confirm that stone was being used to make those particular marks. So that is an open question. Here is the Lady Gararu, 2.8 million year old mandible, which you see here, which has more of a rounded profile to it. It's fairly wide from side to side as opposed to narrow in Australopithecus. This is Afarensis AL from the site of Hadar. And actually, it's from Dakika, but we didn't call it that in those days. And it's relatively short from front to back. So this is more of an ape-like pattern at 3.4 million. At 2.8, you have a pattern of the lower jaw that is much more similar to ours and has been ascribed to the genus Homo. The other thing that Darwin emphasized, of course, was brain expansion. We see this in Ethiopia. This example is from the Middle Awash, about 160,000 years in age. Homo sapiens is known from over 200,000 years in southern Ethiopia with a larger brain size, falling within the modern range. And there also is a re-examination of specimens from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco that may take the origins of sapiens as far back as 300,000 years. I have focused on Eastern Africa because of the density of fossils, the very fairly complete record, the accurate dating, and the associations between fossils, artifacts, and animals. Darwin's preview that Africa would be the place was really verified in 1924 when the late Raymond Dart was given a specimen from a site known as Tong. It's the Tong baby. And he thought that that was the missing link, a term which we don't use anymore. And South Africa, for many years, dominated our ideas of what happened in the early stages of human evolution. My view is that perhaps an early, less derived, more primitive-like creature like Afarensis made it to South Africa and evolved in a very different evolutionary arena. That there was a real separation in terms of South Africa and Eastern Africa. We never find the same species in both places. We have Australopithecus robustus in South Africa, boisei in East Africa. We have Africanus in South Africa, but not in East Africa. So I think that rather than looking at the South African fossils as the ancestors to later hominins, it's interesting to look at how inventive natural selection has been, that these two areas were reproductively isolated from one another, and there were very different ecological conditions between South Africa and East Africa. And it just gives us an insight into the ability of natural selection to really create very different kinds of early hominins, with the earliest appearance of our own species, Homo sapiens, in northern, whether it's Western or Eastern Africa. And the archaeological proxies that we have for very complex cognition range from about 250,000 years ago right on up to 65,000 years ago. You have some examples here decorated in ground ochre, very sophisticated bone and stone tools, and the use of shells for necklaces and decoration, and pieces of ochre, such as this from Blombos, is decorated with these various striations that are regrooved over and over. Maybe this was a little block of ochre that was wet and then used as a stamp to identify members of that group. And probably one of the most interesting things in Southern Africa was the very early discovery of a technological breakthrough using heat treatment of stone to enhance the ability to flake those tools, which we originally thought was something that happened in Europe. But this was also something that first happened in Africa. So the greater conclusion is that Africa is, of course, where we were crafted. I don't like to necessarily choose a particular site or a particular space, but I see Africa as the cradle of human evolution, and where all of the important innovations that Darwin had predicted make us human first appeared. And with that, I'm going to end with this tree of life. We know that this was not a progression from ape to modern humans directly. It had a multitude of branches. We're just one little twig right up here on the tree of life. But we have substantiated that bipedality and maybe reduction in canine size was one of the first major things that separated us from a common ape ancestor. That there has been a significant increase in brain size reflected in tool making, to the point where here we are in very different places in very different time zones, using this incredible technology um, to communicate with one another and to exchange ideas. And there is evidence, even from Australopithecus, of a slightly extended childhood, that they were more altricial, meaning more care, than, say, Ramidus did. And that over time there was very strong selection for this complex cognition and also for cooperation that ultimately led to Homo sapiens, supposedly intelligent man. I have my questions about that, but it is a record that firmly places humans within the natural world. And that's why I think Huxley's book is so incredibly important, Man's Place in Nature. We must remember that. We must remember that we are not super organic. We are not above nature. We are part of the natural world, and to the same forces that crafted our ancestors. And most importantly, that regardless of our beliefs, regardless of our nationalities, regardless of features like skin color or eye shape, we are all one species that had a common origin, and that origin was in Africa. As we know, all of us carry progenitor genes that first appeared in Africa. So, with this, I will leave this and again express my appreciation to all of you for your superb organization of this symposium, and to tell you how humbled I am to have had this opportunity to speak to all of you. Thank you very much, and I wish you a wonderful rest of this few days celebrating the great Charles Darwin. Thank you.